Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10x Growth Strategies podcast. I'm your host, Saradha Sriram, Business Technology Strategist. In today's episode, we have with us Vlad Moskovski, an executive coach who specializes in helping senior leadership teams build effective organizational cultures as companies navigate growth. Welcome to our podcast, Vlad.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We are too. Today, we will explore insights from the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and discuss how understanding the mind body connection can transform leadership approaches. Vlad, as a leadership coach, how did you first discover the book The Body Keeps the Score and what initially resonated with you?
You know, I think what happened was I started hearing about it a number of years ago in various circles that I'm in with founders, with other coaches, with other consultants. And I got curious because I know that trauma is, a very important topic. And my background prior to being an executive coach was a mindfulness teacher. And so I was very aware that the body has a lot going on there. So I got very curious about the book, and it's been really, really transformative because it's really changed the way that I approach my work.
That's very interesting to hear, your background in mindfulness. I have practiced yoga and try to be mindful, but of course not as effective, but good to hear of your background. So, how do you see the connection between trauma as described in the book and the challenges, specifically as you coach executive leadership? How do they deal with it in high pressure environments?
Yeah, I mean, being a leader is really difficult. It's stressful, it's intense, and the pressure is really big. And so it takes a certain amount of resilience to even be in that role and sustain that. What I find very often is that because I'm not a therapist, I don't really get into what's your trauma. That's not the conversation that we're having. But I notice things when they show up in some of our conversations or engagement with companies. And so, one of the signs of trauma in the book, he talks about emotional, somatic, and behavioral signs. And with some, not all, but some of my clients, I do notice that some of these signs are definitely there. And so it makes me wonder and more curious about what kind of trauma. And I'm not talking big trauma like sexual abuse or war. Um, and actually, I was living in Israel for 2 years when Saddam Hussein was bombing Israel. And so it's a little bit similar to what is happening in Ukraine right now. A little bit, I think much less intense, but I basically had to carry a gas mask around with me in case there was a bombing. So that kind of trauma is very, very intense. And the kind of trauma that the book talks about is sometimes smaller in terms of its kind of the story that you would tell. It's sometimes difficult to notice. For example, parents are unavailable or they disregard a child and their needs. Say, oh, that's not important, or you don't need that. Over time, that starts to have an effect. So, what the book talks about was that on an emotional level, there can be frequent or common anxiety in someone's nervous system. There can be disconnection of various sorts, and that can look really different. There can be low self worth, which actually leads to a kind of striving and ambition that, frankly, sometimes leaders are valued for. So there's a really interesting thing happening where a lot of leaders are in their position because of the level of ambition and striving that they have within them. But once they've done some of their inner work, and self awareness is a big part of it, what they find is that underneath that ambition and that striving and that competition is some of these deeper issues which fall under this low case of trauma. So, for example, I'm not good enough. And so I need to try harder. I need to be the best. I need to be number one. The perfectionism that comes with that. Very, very common in leaders. What else? Chronic tension, chronic pain, always being on edge. It's interesting that our society, in some ways, it kind of almost pushes us to say, if you have these things, you might be suffering, but you'll achieve a lot. You know, and so there is a kind of process when I work with leaders of really, it's almost like unwinding their nervous system and their decision making so that they can achieve the same results or even better results without the pain, without the stress, without the constant pushing, without some of the reactivity that people feel in their emotional selves and some of the chronic pain that they feel in their bodies, lack of sleep, all these things.
That is so true. How your daily life and your previous experiences, they kind of affect a lot of things that you do in your daily life. Based on what you said, you've spent some time working on this. How has understanding, trauma's impact on the nervous system changed your approach to the coaching executives through these organization changes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because when I first started doing this work, I would meet someone where they are, which is typically very intellectual. Hey, I have this leadership challenge. There's this decision making. There's this relationship that's not working, and it's very mental. It's a kind of fast, rapid mental engagement, and that's generally where people are at when we first start the conversation. One of the things that I've discovered is if I stay at that level of just mental, we can shift things a little bit but not for long. And they generally people regress or they basically don't make progress. They don't transform. So what I've started to learn to do based on some of this insight about trauma, about somatic intelligence, about getting people out of survival mode is to slow everything down. And the only way you do that is getting out of the mind because the mind is very fast. Like if you and I were having this conversation right now and I was to go, now, suddenly, I've accessed my nervous system. I've accessed the parasympathetic part of my nervous system, which means automatically I feel myself dropping down, getting a little bit slower. So, what I end up doing with my clients is I help them move between the intellect, more of the feeling self, the emotional parts, and then the somatic awareness. And I'll tell you a story that I think really captures this very well. I was just recently on a call with a client. He's a senior director at a company that manages a very big amount of investment in real estate. Um, we do two types of work together. One is I support him in his role as a leader of a strategy across his entire portfolio. The other is on his leadership and personal development. So this was a session about personal development. And he said something about, something happened at work and there was a junior person that did something that seemed incorrect. Someone came from legal and wanted to attack that person, and I defended them and blocked them. And then when I really looked at what was happening, I realized that actually the junior person did nothing wrong. And yet I haven't told them about this situation. So he's been protecting them. And I said, why do you think that's going on? He said, because it's going to be really difficult. And I've been avoiding the conversation because I don't want to burden them. So we started getting into what's behind the avoidance. And he gave me a lot of mental this and this and this, the typical things you would expect. And then I said, why don't we go down to the level of the body? And we've been working on this for a few months now. And I said, notice as you think about this situation and going to that person to tell them, because they probably should know, even just for their own personal growth and learning as they move up the ladder in the company. I said, what do you, as you think about the situation, what do you notice in your body? And he was like, oh, I have so much tension in my chest, in my shoulders. It's going up my jaw. And I said, okay, so that's the thing behind your avoidance. On a nervous system level, you feel those sensations and you want to avoid them. And what we did with him was a very common practice in the somatic world was observe the sensations. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to push them away. Just be there with them. And what happens is over the course of several minutes, inevitably, those sensations go from a 7 of intensity to a 4, to a 2, to a 1. And when that happened, suddenly, magical moment happened. He said, you know what? So this is like 30 seconds of observing the sensations, right? Silence. I'm just sitting there with him. He's observing. Suddenly, he comes out of it. He says, you know what? There's another way to frame this entire situation. I just had a brilliant idea how I can talk to this person, and it's not their fault, and then I don't have to carry the burden. So what's amazing to me about this story was that I didn't tell him, like, look, you need to reframe this differently. I could have, and sometimes I do. But in this situation, as soon as the sensations became smaller and less intense, because he was okay with them, he was accepting and not avoiding, his brain changed. And suddenly a new idea sparked, a new perspective. And that's a transformation. And that's not going to go away. And no amount of intellectual conversation would have gotten us there.
That's a wonderful story because I think what you really did using one of the ideas in the book where the importance of feeling safe in one's own body is something that you help them go through. And that psychological safety that you built for him, I guess that was something they used to use it for their teams too. And they were able to maintain their own physical and emotional well being. So thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of teams, there was a lot of research done at Google and other places about psychological safety,
Hmm.
right? And it's actually very well documented now that in terms of performance, psychological safety is even above intellect or resume or talent or even resources for that matter. It's like if a team feels really safe, they will outperform a more skilled or more resourced team. They will collaborate better. So that psychological safety, either on a one-on-one level, on a team level, or even more interestingly to me, on an organizational level, is really fascinating because right now, your edge, there's so much competition, right? And with all these AI tools, it's like anybody can build a company basically with one or two people. Like the tools are just incredible, right? You don't need to code so much, you don't need to design. It's all available. So the edge for founders, for entrepreneurs, is their idea, their team, and the quality of their relationships and the environment that they create, because that's going to allow them to innovate, to collaborate, and to get through the difficult moments that inevitably happen in business.
I absolutely agree with it because I personally seen that happen with my own teams when I'm in leadership positions. And people know that I've got their back. I see a tremendous improvement in performance and a collective shift within the team too. So it's good to hear that it is industry practice to do that.
Yeah.
As we explore the book further, how do you think leaders can recognize when the decision making is being influenced by body's trauma responses rather than clear thinking?
So, are you familiar with the amygdala hijack?
No, I'm not.
So for those that are not, there's a big emphasis on if you're acting from a place of deep pain or a wound, you're going to be in survival mode. And what that means on a brain level is that there's a part of your brain called the amygdala, which is back here. It's called the reptilian brain. It's responsible for fight or flight, survival, fear, aggression, and I think shame and some other things are thrown in there. So these are very intense emotions. These are intense reactions. Decision making from an amygdala state is generally great if you have to fight off a bear or run away from a tiger, and terrible if you're running a company, right? You need intense amounts of anger, fear, and adrenaline to get your body activated to fight off a predator or to run away. For example, I was hiking one day and I inadvertently stepped on a wasp's nest and I started getting stung very intensely. I had, 5 or 7 stings in a matter of seconds. And that amygdala response kicked in, and I just started running at top speed all the way out of the forest, all the way to the parking lot, jumped in the car, and I was shaking with the amount of adrenaline in my body. So, if I had been calm and strategic, if I had been thoughtful or collaborative, I might have been in the hospital or dead. Instead, my amygdala saved me. So that's really great. What I see in leaders sometimes is that if they're acting from that place of the amygdala response, they will have a flare of emotions. That's actually another client that I've worked with quite a bit on reactivity, right? Responding with an over intense reaction of anger, for example. This is something that is definitely a sign that there's something deeper going on. Sometimes the book also talks about how if someone's response is way bigger than what objectively it should be in that situation, they're overreacting, they're very triggered, that's also a sign. So, what happens on the decision making level is that it creates in other people around that person a state of mistrust. You talked about trust and how important it is to have someone's back. Well, if someone's reaction is a little bit unpredictable and they can blow up and explode, you can't trust that person. And so that level of trust, when it's not there, other people around them will sometimes withhold information. Or they'll make decisions based on something that's very emotional rather than rational. Or they'll be shut down emotionally and they won't have access to their intuition, which is so, so important in business. If you talk to really great business people, on some level, they know that the intellect processes information, but the gut knows, right? It's almost like the deeper knowing that cuts beyond the spreadsheet of the pros and cons. And I often talk to people about strategy and how to cultivate strategic vision and execution. And so much of that is connecting the intellect with the gut, with your intuition. Again, the gut is literally like the center of your body in your stomach, which is called the second brain. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but there's so many aspects of decision making that get influenced both on the individual level and then also how other people, because a leader is not a leader without the people around them. It's an entire ecosystem. So the things that get fed to them and how they respond both get significantly altered.
And again, it is a very contextual thing too, right? Learning to work between your gut and using the brain kind of thing. But yes, you did answer my question. You also want to kind of segue into this month May being like the mental health awareness month. How do you help leaders navigate vulnerability in professional settings, especially when discussing mental health and emotional well-being?
Yeah. Vulnerability is a really important topic, and I would say a very difficult one. So, for example, let's take a founder of a company. Um, there's inherently a quality to leadership that involves strength. And the kind of strength that is modeled in our society is strength of invulnerability. Think Superman, right? And so leaders have almost like a very deep set belief that they need to show invulnerability, right? Invulnerability, lack of vulnerability. That's literally in the word. And so what that means is that with their team, sometimes they withhold information or they emotionally are reserved because they want to show that invulnerability. With investors, same thing. They can't, if there's a VCs that are invested or your board, you can't show that vulnerability because they might replace you, they might fire you, who knows, right? It's a very tricky situation. So what ends up happening is that leaders end up feeling isolated and lonely very, very often. And it's completely tied to their identity of invulnerability. And so to bring it back to vulnerability, it's a slow process. It's not one day we have a conversation and then suddenly you go off and at your next all hands meeting, you say, I woke up this morning and I was feeling really terrible, so sad, confused. I'm not sure about my role. You're not going to do that in your all hands meeting. So the way that I approach it is we start to explore some of the issues with invulnerability. And there are good things about it, but the costs are so high on a personal level and on a team level. Then, when it's time and they feel open enough, we start to do little experiments. I'm a big believer in experiments. So, an experiment might be show a little bit of vulnerability with someone in your life where the stakes are not so high, and then see what's the impact on you and on the other person, on the relationship, in the situation. And frequently, through this series of experiments, they start to realize that the right kind of vulnerability in the right situation, framed in the right way, is very powerful. It creates dramatic effects in your relationships, in your situations, and it increases intimacy. It increases trust. It increases safety. And all these things are linked to, in the business world, for example, relationships is everything. So if you can increase or deepen trust and relationship building, you're going to be ahead. So slowly, through little experiments, we start to move in the direction of vulnerability. And what I found is if I try to move too quickly, the person immediately shuts down. Right? They just, it's too risky. There's too much risk. Yeah. Which actually reminds me of, in the book, there's this concept of self-leadership. And this is something that I find to be really important. I don't often use the word self-leadership, but I use self-awareness and choice. So when you are more aware of your brain, your emotional self, and your body, you start to have more choices. When you're not just reacting out of a sensation in your body without knowing why. When you see it and you feel it, and then you can choose differently, that's really powerful. So my company, Eleva Consulting, after doing a deep analysis of all of my client work over the last 15 years, my corporate clients, my founders, I've come to realize that there are basically 6 skills that people really need to have. And leading with self-awareness is number 4. They're not prioritized, but that is a very, very important skill. And the other one is building emotional resilience for when things get tough. For example, right now I have a friend that is in the climate space.
Hmm.
It's a very bad time to be in the climate space. Everything is constricting, and so there's a sense that there might be some layoffs in the future, and it's a very uncomfortable thing for a founder to do, especially a founder that's human centric, that cares. So again, where's the opportunity to be vulnerable there?
That is so true. And thank you for really summarizing, specifically talking about self awareness and self leadership. That was something that I really took off from the book, too. Uh, is there, to summarize and kind of close this episode, apart from the topics that you talked about somatic, awareness, etc., and you gave us some really good examples, is there something that we could do as, not everybody is a founder. I know you work very closely with executive leadership, but for up and coming leaders, is there something that they can include in their daily practice so as they grow in their roles, um, you know, they learn a few things ahead of time rather than hitting upon those situations and then discovering? Is there something that they could do proactively to
Yeah.
manage?
I mean, there are so many practices that are mentioned in the book that are out there, from IFS to breathwork to yoga to mindfulness based practices with somatic awareness. But what I've been thinking a lot about recently, in kind of a bigger frame, is time. We are a society that is time poor. Everybody, everybody is crunched for time. There is a time crisis in everybody's life. And that means that people rush and they move from thing to thing without giving it the due time that it deserves. And so, if I was to suggest one big category, was that look at your time, how you use your time, and spend, like, carve out time, protect time where you just focus on your inner self, not just your thoughts, your emotions, and your body. However that looks like for you, you don't even have to have training. You don't need to go to a meditation retreat. You don't need to read books. This is innate within us. We just have to have the space and the desire to look. And then when we look inside, suddenly things emerge. We start to learn about ourselves. I'm a really big believer in know thyself, because then everything else just becomes easier.
I agree.
So I would say time. Time is the big thing. I want to spend time thinking about time. I've been having really great conversations recently with founders, with entrepreneurs, with executives, about time and how can we expand time, slow down time, because it's just a pandemic. It's really a chronic pandemic of our society, and it's normalized.
Yeah, that's rather unfortunate. But again, I want to say, thank you for your time today in speaking with us. To summarize, the body keeps the score reveals how trauma physically alters our bodies and brains. It has offered revolutionary approaches to healing through reconnecting with our physical selves. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to explore some of the powerful insights that you shared with us today. Thank you, Vlad.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to say to the audience that might be listening or hearing this that, um, some resources, there's lots of resources available, and I'm happy to provide resources or be a guide on this journey with them.
Absolutely. I'm sure people will leverage that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening.